Hold on. Y'all tired?
We just have to sing faster.
Okay, we're going to sing a little faster, but we're going to try to get a beat, a pulse together, okay? I'm getting tired just looking at you. I'm like, so here's my feet. Just move your feet.
Marching to Freedom Land.
We're marching. Feeling your body.
Is
Really?
this really the tempo you want? You're slowing down.
I know, right? Ooh, didn't know you'd get your workout.
We all carry this together.
Everybody's got a right to live.
Everybody's got a right.
Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. 'Cause everybody's got a right. How about breathe? Everybody's got a right to breathe. Everybody's got a right to breathe. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. 'Cause everybody's got a right to breathe. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to love. Everybody's got a right to breathe. Everybody's got a right to thrive. Everybody
Thrive.
Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to thrive. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. 'Cause everybody's got a right to thrive. Live. Everybody's got a right to live.
Like a really urgent whisper.
Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. 'Cause everybody's got a right to
Now let it rip. Here we go. Like to live. Everybody's
got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. 'Cause everybody's got a right to live. One more time. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. 'Cause everybody's got a right to live. Yeah, Albuquerque.
Let's hear it for our wonderful theomusicologists. And as they've told you, music is an absolutely essential component to any movement, and we're recovering that. And we hope that everybody here will take an opportunity to be in a setting where you're going to be trained in theomusicology, because we are going to sing our way to the revolution. Am I introducing you? I'm not. This is Scott Sharp. He's going to welcome you.
Hi, folks. Well, you shouldn't clap for somebody you don't know who they are. Yeah. Sorry. Anyway, hi, I'm Scott. I'm the senior pastor here at Central. And I just wanted to say thank you for being with us. We're glad to host you, glad that you're here, glad that you're a part of something that's bigger than yourselves. Would appreciate, take the time to turn your phone to its most sort of respectful position, because there's nothing worse to be a speaker than to hear some random ringtone. And please be gentle with the furniture with your coffee. Okay? I'm Scott, senior pastor. I said that. But anyway, hey, thanks for being here. And part of, as I said back last fall when William Barber was here, part of it, there's so many levels of these things, and part of what we can do is simply open the door. So glad to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. So I'm the Reverend Holly Beaumont. I'm the organizing director of Interfaith Worker Justice New Mexico. And we got the bug in our heads about a year ago that we wanted to bring Chris. And so we approached him and began to negotiate an event. And it's been a long process of waiting and working and holding our breath and now exhaling. And we're delighted that you are as interested in hearing the message that Chris has to bring as we are. So I know that you're going to want to know what we're doing today. So so there are no handouts. There are no programs in the interest of saving paper, time, labor, and resources. We'll be giving you an online link, email address that you can go to request a whole bunch of handouts that we will send you online. And then you can make hard copies, or you can just keep them wherever they are. So that explains why you didn't get a bunch of paper when you came in. This is our plan. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Marian Naranjo, who is the founder and director of Hope, Honor Our Pueblo Existence. She's an elder and spiritual leader at Santa Clara Pueblo, and I consider her a close friend, a mentor, and we have worked together on many issues, particularly around the issues of nuclear weapons in New Mexico. She's going to bless this event and remind us where we are, which is how we always begin. Then Chris Hedges is going to do a presentation for about 30 minutes. And then we're going to move into covering the 4 evils as named by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King 51 years ago at Riverside Church when he preached Beyond Vietnam, exactly 1 year before he was assassinated. It was on April 4th, 1967. And for those of us who remember, that was a shift. It was a seismic shift. Because Dr. King brought into the conversation of civil rights the issue of the military-industrial complex that we were experiencing with the Vietnam War, and also began to turn towards the issue of economic justice. And as you know, when he went to Memphis to stand with the sanitation workers who had gone on strike, he had been advised by some of his closest allies not to go, that he was embarking on expanding his movement in a direction that would simply not be tolerated by the powers that be. Because he was suggesting that white union members and black non-union workers needed to come together in solidarity. And that was his vision. And that is part of the reason why the tides turned, at least in the minds of some who are trying to analyze this whole event. So the 3 evils that Dr. King named were materialism as it impacts poverty, racism, militarism, and then because of the times in which we live, we have added environmental degradation. So those are the 4 evils that we're going to address as a sacrifice zone, and we have some really amazing leaders to present on each of those. They each get about 10 minutes, and then we've invited Chris to take about 5 minutes to respond to them. So this is going to be a conversation. And we want to be very engaging, and it's relaxed and informal, and we want to really sort of think together and collectively about how we understand New Mexico as a sacrifice zone, but how we are going to reclaim and restore New Mexico, because we are tired of having our rich resources exploited by colonists and corporations and irresponsible government. No more. No more. And then we're going to close, and we're going to have a few more songs, and you're invited to go into the reception area or the fellowship hall community room, which is to your left through this door, where there will be some tabling so you can take the next step with organizations you'd like to connect with, and you can also meet Chris and buy some of his books at his book signing. So that's what we're going to do. Restrooms. We're not having a formal break. We're all adults. If you need to go to the restroom, get up, go to the restroom, and then come back. Out the door, turn left. Just past the reception area, there's a kind of a little hallway into where the restrooms are, and it's clearly marked. Oh, and there are also some right down that hall, so you can go out to the back. Thank you, Susan. For Mary and Naranjo's blessing, we are reminded to turn off your cell phones and no pictures, no videos, and that this is a sacred moment. Is there anything I've forgotten to say as we move now into the program? Let's have the next slide. And then again, Jesus is our very able body. And then one more. Oh, in appreciation for our sponsors. And I'm saying it now because I don't want to leave it to the end because some of you might have to leave. But if you've been receiving our flyers, you know that this has been a community effort. And we are deeply grateful to the many sponsors who have contributed to the cost of this event, to bringing Chris here, and just in terms of being a part of this whole campaign in New Mexico. So if you are a member of any of those organizations, thank you. And we would encourage you to reach out and thank them for their support and for the amazing work that they continue to do in New Mexico. Okay, I think now the next slide. All right. And so everyone, I'll just give you about 30 seconds to take a deep breath and settle into a quietness as Marian Naranjo blesses our time together and reminds us where we are.
Good afternoon. My name is Ken Mayers, and I'm the co-founder of the Santa Fe chapter of Veterans for Peace. I'm a former career Marine Corps officer, resigned my commission just a few months before Dr. King made his Riverside Church speech. And it was one of the things that impelled me towards Veterans for Peace. The reason I've been asked to introduce Chris Hedges is because back on December 16th of 2010, Veterans for Peace organized a major demonstration in Washington, D.C. At the White House with a gathering in Lafayette Park before going to the fence of the White House. And Chris Hedges was one of our keynote speakers at that event. And later that day, 130 of us were arrested at the White House. And I had the rare honor of sharing a jail cell with Chris Hedges. Chris told me that was the first time that he was ever arrested for civil disobedience, and it set him forth on another career of civil disobedience, which I think has been fairly remarkable. I think most of you know about Chris Hedges. He was a foreign correspondent for 2 decades, spent 15 years with the New York Times, reported from 50 different countries. He was bureau chief in the Middle East for 4 years. He was bureau chief in the Balkans, in Sarajevo during the war there. And after he came back, he gave us a speech at a college commencement just early 2003 in which he criticized the Iraq War. His microphone was cut off. He was booed off the stage. And since that time, his focus has shifted primarily to troubles within the United States, the troubles of corporate power, of the maldistribution of income, of the dying stages of capitalism. And predictions are always dangerous, but I think I can confidently predict that what Chris has to tell you here today is not going to cheer you up, but hopefully it will stimulate you to increased effectiveness. Chris, we're glad to have you here. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. As some of you may know, I come out of a religious tradition. My father was a Presbyterian minister. I went to seminary myself, although was, when I finished, rejected for ordination. In the Presbyterian Church, you are approved for ordination before you go to seminary, and your final moment before being approved for ordination is going before a committee and telling the committee what your call is. And a standard call would be being an assistant pastor somewhere. And I told the committee that I was going to go to El Salvador to be a freelance journalist and cover the war. And there was a long silence. And the head of the committee said, well, we don't ordain journalists. My father, who'd been a parish minister for 40 years, was seated outside. And I often think back that it must have been difficult for him to see his son come so close. And I was leaving literally within a week or two to go cover the war. And he said to me, well, you're ordained to write. And that was my calling. My calling was to go to El Salvador and subsequently spend 20 years in war zones across the world, places like Gaza. I was in Sarajevo during the war, giving a voice to people bearing the brunt of horrific oppression and violence. And my close friend Stephen Kinzer at the New York Times once in exasperation said, you're not really a journalist, you're just a pastor pretending to be a journalist. But I actually think that good journalists, like good pastors or ministers, care about the same thing, and that's the truth. I was a journalist for many years, 15 of them with the New York Times, and what journalists do is manipulate facts. And I can take the same set of facts and manipulate them any way I want. And if I'm a good careerist, I will manipulate those facts to serve the power elite. But if I care about my reader, I will manipulate those facts to tell the truth. I came back to the United States. I've spent very little time here, over 2 decades, and was appalled at what had happened to this country. The corporate coup d'etat in slow motion, as John Ralston Saul calls it, that destroyed our democracy, and that is now pushed us onto the precipice of potential catastrophic destruction of ecocide, the destruction of the very systems that sustain life. And I look at these forces as somebody who comes out of a religious tradition. And I don't mean to be overly dramatic, but as forces of death. And we are now called to fight for those forces of life. And I think one of the greatest or most difficult existential dilemmas for all of us is to at once grasp and articulate how bleak our situation is and yet resist anyway. And I believe that for those of us who resist, and resist successfully, and I don't mean success as it's measured by the world. There's a wonderful book I urge you all to read by America's greatest theologian, James Cone, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, where he looks back on the African American experience in America, and in particularly lynching, which he says was the crucifixion. And yet all of those white theologians, all of those white churches were unable to see it. And at the beginning of the book, he writes about faith as the inversion of the world's values. We don't allow the world to tell us what success is. I was friends with the great priest Daniel Berrigan, who I once asked him how he defined faith, and he said, faith was the belief that the good draws to it the good, even if empirically everything around us says otherwise. The Buddhists will call it karma. And I think that, as Solzhenitsyn writes in the Gulag Archipelago, in order to resist these forces of death, in order to stand up, we are going to have to find faith. I don't necessarily mean faith in an orthodox sense, and it certainly can come in a secular form. But resistance now will be primarily based in faith, in the belief that the good draws to it the good. That standing up and carrying out a moral act, an act of resistance, will, as Auden says, be that ironic point of light that flashes out wherever the just exchange their messages. And having lived in disintegrating societies for as long as I did, and having been around magnificent figures, I got to El Salvador not long after Archbishop Oscar Romero was assassinated. I covered the Velvet Revolution, was in the Magic Lantern Theater every evening with Václav Havel and all of the figures, the dissidents who eventually inherited power with the fall of communism. One saw that those who had the courage, even if they were alone, as Romero was, to stand up and defy radical evil, that moral courage rippled outwards across a society, even a society that seemed not to be able to hear or see. So I was in Prague that winter, 1989, and all through the streets of Prague were posters of a young Charles University student, Jan Palach, who in 1968, to protest the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia and the overthrow of Dubček and imposition of a pro-Soviet government, had gone to the central square, Wenceslas Square, and lit himself on fire. 4 days later, he died of his burns. His funeral was a non-event, not covered by the state media. The funeral procession was broken up by the police. When his grave became a shrine, his body was exhumed, his remains cremated, his ashes given to his mother, and his mother was told that she was not allowed to rebury them. And 2 weeks after that government fell, 10,000 Czechs marched to Red Army Square and renamed it Jan Palach Square. I was in Wenceslas Square when Marta Kubasheva, who had been the most popular singer in Czechoslovakia before '68, walked out onto the balcony. In '68, she had sung an anthem called A Prayer for Marta, which was a song of defiance. And the response of the government when it seized power, backed by the Soviets, was to destroy her recording stock, ban her from the airwaves. And she spent the intervening years from '68 to '89 working on an assembly line in a toy factory. And when she walked out on that balcony and began to sing a prayer for Marta in front of 500,000 Czechs, everyone knew every word. That's the power of resistance. And at this crucial moment in human history, I speak especially as a father, it is incumbent upon us to stand up and use our bodies to carry out acts of non-cooperation, to protect our communities, to protect the ecological systems of life that sustain us, and to fight on behalf of those who will come later. I'm not naive about the forces we face. I'm not even particularly optimistic about success. And yet, I want my children to be able to say, he tried. The moral calling of our age is to battle these corporate forces that have seized control globally and commodified everything. Commodified the natural world, commodified human beings. Karl Polanyi, in his book, The Great Transformation, he's an economist, writes about unfettered capitalism. And he says correctly that when all impediments and restraints are lifted, capitalism commodifies everything around it until exhaustion or collapse. And we are now watching that exhaustion and collapse. And he actually uses the word sacred. He said that when nothing in society has an intrinsic value, but only a monetary value, when you destroy the sacred, then you commit collective suicide. I don't hold any faith in the formal structures of power, including the Democratic Party. I've spent many years working with Ralph Nader. I was a speechwriter. I know, and there is no American who has fought corporate power as long or with as much integrity as Ralph Nader. And he did not steal the election from George Bush. And Nader, who watched under Tony Coelho originally and then the Clintons, watched the Democratic Party go to the corporate feeding trough so that eventually it began to compete with the Republican Party to serve corporate power. Bill Clinton being the kind of poster child for this faux liberal entity who spoke in the traditional feel your pain language of liberalism while he thrust a knife into the back of the working class. NAFTA, the greatest betrayal of the working class in this country since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act. The destruction of welfare, and 70% of the original recipients in our welfare system were children. The explosion of mass incarceration, the greatest civil rights issue of our time. The deregulation of the FCC, which allows a half-dozen corporations to control the airwaves. And we're watching Sinclair Broadcasting, which is straight out of 1984, seize what could be up to 70+% of the television market. The destruction of Glass-Steagall which created the firewall between investment and commercial banks and precipitated the 2008 meltdown. All of this came out of a Democratic Party that realized that if it served corporate interests, it would get corporate money, which it did. By the 90s, the Democrats had fundraising parity in terms of corporate money with the Republicans, and in 2008, when Obama ran, he got more. We have to go back to our roots. We have to pit power against power. That will only come when we organize against the structures of power. Power is always the problem. Even those, perhaps, who are somewhat more enlightened need that pressure. That New Deal came out of the Progressive and the Communist Party and radical unions, the old CIO. Roosevelt's quite open about that in his correspondence. Actually says in a letter to one of his fellow oligarchs that if they don't begin to address the social disintegration, we'll have revolution. So in essence, give up some of your money now, or you may lose all of it. And that's how you got the government creating 12 million jobs. All of the New Deal programs, including Social Security, the right to unionize. All of that's been eviscerated, and that's a longer history than I have time today to go into, although I've written about it in Death of the Liberal Class in particular. But we're almost back to where we started from. And I think that much of our history has been quite effectively erased. Historical amnesia is always the tool of totalitarian states to sever us from our roots. And I think one of the things that's been effectively blotted out is the extent to which religious communities were fundamental in, as Howard Zinn says, opening up the spaces of American democracy. The abolitionists, Rauschenbusch and the social gospel, the civil rights movement. I teach in a prison through Rutgers. It's a college program. This semester I'm teaching Les Miserables. And when you write a description of your course, it has to go through the censorship of the prison authorities. So you always write something that sounds as innocuous as possible. And a few years ago, I said I was going to teach a course on American history and the three branches of government and our founding fathers, and it got approved. And I bought all of my students Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States. But Zinn's right. This was a closed system from the beginning by white slaveholding elites who lusted for campaigns of genocide against indigenous communities. Washington, of course, because the British had set that dividing line, buying up huge tracts of native land as a speculator and selling it. He was the wealthiest man in the United States, which a lot of people don't know. And it was been a battle. It's been a battle. We had the bloodiest labor wars in the industrialized world. Hundreds of American workers murdered. Tens of thousands lost their jobs and blacklisted. All of those movements, and some of you remember the 60s as I do, what Samuel Huntington called our excess of democracy. COINTELPRO, the assassination of leaders, Martin, Malcolm, Fred Hampton. They will play hard and violent when they feel their interests threatened. And that's our job. There's a scene in Kissinger's memoirs, don't buy the book. It's 71, huge anti-war demonstration, and Nixon has taken empty city buses to ring the White House. And he's standing at the window saying, "Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us." And that is exactly where we want people in power to be. I spent 2 years writing this book with the great cartoonist Joe Sacco on America's sacrifice zones. And New Mexico knows well what a sacrifice zone is. And the point of the book was that we better start looking at what capitalism has done to these sacrifice zones, because now we've become one vast sacrifice zone. The life that they have exterminated in these, whether it's the coal fields of Appalachia or the bleak ruins of deindustrialized cities, will become or be normalized for everyone. Capitalism, as Polanyi points out, has no internal limits. And much of the destruction of indigenous culture was not only about the seizure of land and resources, but about the destruction of a competing ethic. Another way of community, another way of being, one where those who hoarded for themselves were not the most powerful elements, but perhaps the most despised. I want to close by reading the end of this book, and it's when Cornel West and I held a people's hearing of Goldman Sachs in Zuccotti Park, and then marched on Goldman Sachs, where we blocked the entrance and were arrested. Faces appeared to me moments before protesters from Occupy Wall Street and I were arrested on a windy November afternoon in front of Goldman Sachs. They were not the faces of the smug Goldman Sachs employees who peered at us through the revolving glass doors and lobby windows. They were not the faces of the blue uniformed police with their dangling plastic handcuffs, or the thuggish Goldman Sachs security personnel whose buzz cuts and dead eyes reminded me of the Stasi. They were not the faces of the demonstrators around me, the ones with massive student debts and no jobs, the ones weighed down by their broken dreams, the ones whose anger and betrayal triggered the street demonstrations and occupations for justice. They were not the faces of the onlookers, the construction workers who seemed cheered by the march on Goldman Sachs, or the suited businessmen who did not. They were faraway faces. They were the faces of children dying. They were tiny, confused, bewildered faces I had seen in the southern Sudan, Gaza, the slums of Brazzaville, Nairobi, Cairo, Delhi, and the wars I covered. They were faces with large, glassy eyes above bloated bellies. They were the small faces of children convulsed by the ravages of starvation and disease. I carry these faces. They do not leave me. I look at my own children and cannot forget them. These other children who never had a chance. War brings with it a host of horrors, but the worst is always the human detritus that war and famine leave behind. The small, frail bodies whose tangled limbs and vacant eyes condemn us all. The wealthy and the powerful, the ones behind the Goldman Sachs, laughed and snapped pictures of us as if we were an odd lunchtime diversion from commodities trading, from hoarding and profit, from the collective sickness of money worship, as if we were creatures in a cage, which in fact we soon were. Goldman Sachs Commodities Index is the most heavily traded in the world. The financial firm hoards futures of rice, wheat, corn, sugar, and livestock, and jacks up commodity prices by as much as 200% on the global market, so that poor families can no longer afford basic staples and literally starve. Hundreds of millions of poor in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America do not have enough to eat in order to feed this mania for profit. The technical jargon learned in business schools and on trading floors effectively masks the reality of what is happening: murder. The cold, neutral words of business and commerce are designed to make systems operate, even systems of death, with a ruthless efficiency. The people behind the windows and those of us with arms locked in a circle on the concrete outside did not speak the same language. Profit, trade, speculation, globalization, war, national security. These are the words they use to justify the snuffing out of tiny lives, acts of radical evil. The glass tower before us was filled with people carefully selected for the polish and self-assurance that come with having been formed in institutions of privilege. Their primary attributes are a lack of consciousness, a penchant for deception, aggressiveness, a worship of money, and an incapacity for empathy or remorse. And it is always the respectable classes, the polished Ivy League graduates, the prep school boys and girls, who are the most susceptible to evil. To be intelligent, as many are, at least in a narrow, analytical way, is morally neutral. These respectable citizens are inculcated in their elitist ghettos with values and norms, including pious acts of charity used to justify their privilege, and a belief in the innate goodness of American power. They are trained to pay deference to systems of authority. They are taught to believe in their own goodness, unable to see or comprehend, and are perhaps indifferent to the cruelty inflicted on others by the exclusive systems they serve. And as norms change, as the world is steadily transformed by corporate forces into a small cabal of predators and a vast herd of human prey, these elites seamlessly replace one set of values with another. These elites obey the rules, they make the system work, and they are rewarded for this. In return, they do not question. We seem to have lost, at least until the advent of the Occupy movement, not only all personal responsibility, but all capacity for personal judgment. And corporate culture absolves all of responsibility. This is part of its appeal. It relieves all from moral choice. There is an unequivocal acceptance of principles such as unregulated capitalism and globalization as a kind of natural law. The steady march of corporate capitalism requires a passive acceptance of new laws and demolished regulations, of bailouts in the trillions of dollars, and the systematic looting of public funds, of lies and deceit. The corporate culture epitomized by Goldman Sachs has seeped into our classrooms, our newsrooms, our entertainment systems, and our consciousness. This corporate culture has stripped us of the right to express ourselves outside of the narrow confines of the established political order. We are forced to surrender our voice. Corporate culture serves a faceless system. It is, as Hannah Arendt wrote, the rule of nobody. And for this very reason, perhaps the least human and most cruel form of rulership. Those who resist, the doubters, outcasts, artists, renegades, skeptics, and rebels, rarely come from the elite. They ask different questions. They seek something else, a life of meaning. They have grasped Immanuel Kant's dictum, if justice perishes, human life on earth has lost its meaning. And in their search, they come to the conclusion that, as Socrates said, it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. This conclusion makes a leap into the moral. It refuses to place a monetary value on human life. It acknowledges human life, indeed all life, as sacred. And this is why, as Arendt points out, the only morally reliable people are not those who say, this is wrong, or this should not be done, but those who say, I can't. The greatest evildoers are those who don't remember because they have never given thought to the matter, and without remembrance nothing can hold them back, Arendt wrote. For human beings, thinking of past matters means moving in the dimension of depth, striking roots, and thus stabilizing ourselves so as not to be swept away by whatever may occur, the zeitgeist or history or simple temptation. The greatest evil is not radical. It has no roots. And because it has no roots, it has no limitations. It can go to unthinkable extremes and sweep over the whole world. There are streaks in my lungs, traces of the tuberculosis I picked up around hundreds of dying Sudanese during the famine I covered as a foreign correspondent. I was strong and privileged and fought off the disease. They were not and did not. The bodies, most of them children, were dumped into hastily dug mass graves. The scars I carry within me are the whispers of these dead. They are the faint marks of those who never had a chance to become men or women, to fall in love and have children of their own. I carried these scars to the doors of Goldman Sachs. I placed myself at the feet of these commodity traders to call for justice, because the dead and those dying in slums and refugee camps across the planet could not make the journey. I see their faces. They haunt me in the day and come to me in the dark. They force me to remember, and they make me choose sides. Thank you.